Listen, somewhere in the 8th or ninth century, a poet whose name has been scoured away by time is crawling through the ribs of a dead city. Ivy strangles marble. Bats pour from a bathhouse vault that once echoed with laughter. The poet's breath fogs in the cold morning, and the words he mutters are half awe, half terror. Because the people who built this place were giants, and giants do not simply die. They leave silence wide enough to swallow centuries. Tonight we follow that silence back to its source. We will walk the full length of a civilization raised in heartbeat and broken just as fast. We will ask the question the poet could not answer. When the work of giants crumbled, what really died? And, more unsettling, what refused to stay dead? Roman Britain. 4 centuries of marble forums wind dark harbors, and roads so straight they seemed carved by the gods. Yet the province that Augustus called the edge of the real was never more than a heartbeat from annihilation. It cost more to hold than it ever returned. It armed its own would-be kings. And in the end, it vanished so completely that only a half-burned poem survived to mourn it. This is not a tale of emperors in gilded halls. It is the story of a frontier, of traders, of engineers, of painted Pictish war bands glimpsed through fog, of African generals who believed they could restore a republic, and of 1,000 ordinary Britons who one morning smelled smoke on the wind and understood the world they knew would never come back. To reach the beginning, we must cross the narrow sea the Romans thought impossible. 21 Roman miles of gray water, churned by 2 oceans, haunted by whirlpools and legends. To Julius Caesar, sailing in 55 BC, it was the edge of everything. To the traders who already swapped Cornish tin for Mediterranean wine, it was merely Tuesday. Yet for Rome, the island was a riddle wrapped in fog. Plutarch records senators who insisted Britain was a myth, an anti-Atlantis invented by frightened sailors. The army disagreed. The army always does. And so, almost a century after Caesar's 2 humiliating withdrawals, Emperor Claudius landed 4 legions on the Kentish shore. He brought elephants. He brought engineers. He brought the certainty that stone could tame the wild. Within a summer, he had taken the lowlands. Within a generation, the province of Britannia stretched from the White Cliffs to the Highland line, and the chalk soil of Kent was already being paved into the first stones of Watling Street. Urbanism was Rome's true religion. Where a Celtic chieftain's hall had once stood, surveyors drew a perfect grid. Where goats grazed, masons raised marble columns shipped from the quarries of Carrara 600 miles away. London, little more than a ford in a marsh, exploded into a port of 20,000 souls. You could breakfast on oysters dredged from the Thames, lunch on garum shipped from Spain, and dine on pepper that had outtraded every border post from the Malabar coast to the Channel. But the grandeur was brittle. Beneath every mosaic floor lay a truth Rome preferred not to name. Britannia was a fortress, not a home. 1/8 of the entire imperial army, 40,000 men, was shackled to this rainy rock. Why? Because every direction held an enemy. To the north, the Picts, whom the Romans called the Painted Ones, fought naked, tattooed, and merciless. To the west, the Silures of Wales ambushed patrols in forests so dark the legionaries swore the sun never rose. Across the North Sea, longboats full of Saxon pirates waited for the equinox gales to subside before rowing south for slaves and silver. And so the walls went up. Not 1, but 2. Hadrian's Wall, 135 kilometers of living stone, garrisoned by infantry and Syrian archers who stamped their tiles in Aramaic. Further north, the Antonine Wall, 63 kilometers of turf and timber, abandoned almost as soon as it was finished because the ground itself rebelled against Rome. Yet the greatest wall was invisible: money. Britannia bled coin. Tin, lead, grain, hunting dogs, even pearls from the Tay, none covered the cost of occupation. Each year, the imperial treasury shipped south more silver than the island ever returned. The accountants in Rome grumbled, but the generals knew a secret. Whoever held Britain could break the empire. Enter Clodius Albinus, governor, idealist, walking contradiction. Born in Tunisia, skin so white his father swore it outshone linen. A soldier's soldier, beloved by the Senate, hated by the emperor. In AD 192, Emperor Commodus, mad, vain, half gladiator, was strangled in his bath. The throne became a prize thrown among wolves. 5 men bit. By the winter of 195, only 2 fangs remained: Severus in Rome, Albinus in Britain. Albinus made the British mistake. He convinced himself that virtue still mattered, that republics could be reborn. He addressed his legions on a rain-lashed parade ground outside Eboracum, modern York, and promised to restore the Senate's ancient power. They cheered. They would have cheered anyone who paid their overdue wages. Then he did the unforgivable. He stripped the island bare. Every legionary, every auxiliary, every scout, every smith who could hold a shield wall. 30,000 men boarded ships and sailed for Gaul. Britannia was left undefended for the first time in 2 centuries. 2 years later, on a ridge near Lyon called Lugdunum, Albinus died. Severus's cavalry rode over his corpse. His head was paraded through Rome. His family were butchered. Order, of a sort, returned. But back in Britain, the damage calcified. Without soldiers, the economy collapsed. Picts poured through the broken wall. Irish Scoti raided the western coasts. Saxon longships beached under moonlight and walked inland unchallenged. Hoards of silver, thousands of coins, were buried in panic and never reclaimed. Archaeologists still find them wrapped in cloth that rotted into the soil alongside the bones of people who believed they would come back for their money. Severus arrived in person in AD 208, leading an army of 40,000. He pushed north into Caledonia, burned crops, took hostages, boasted he had conquered the island. The campaign achieved nothing except to exhaust his troops. On the return march, he fell ill and died at Eboracum. His final words to his sons, "Live in harmony, enrich the soldiers, despise everyone else," were carved into marble that would itself be smashed within a generation. The province staggered on. Towns still held markets. Bathhouses still steamed. But the coins buried in the soil grew ever more recent, ever more frantic. In the countryside, tribal leaders who had once accepted Roman titles now minted their own coins, spoke their own gods, worshipped their own gods. The cities, those glittering mirages, became islands. Outside their walls, the forests crept back. By the dawn of the 5th century, the Western Empire was hemorrhaging. Vandals, Alans, Sueves crossed the Rhine on New Year's Eve, AD 406, and froze the frontier solid under their boots. Britain, always peripheral, was told to look to its own defense. In AD 410, the Emperor Honorius sent a letter to the cities of Britain. Civitates defendite vos. Cities, defend yourselves. No legions followed. The courier who carried that decree sailed away and never returned. What happened next is a fog of conflicting voices. British tyrants, vortices of power with names like Constantine, Gratian, Marcus, rose and were cut down within months. Saxon foederati, settled earlier as border guards, realized the guards were now the border. War bands from the east rode across in ever larger numbers, not as raiders but as settlers. They brought their language, their laws, their women, their gods. They called the land east of the old Roman roads Angeln, the corner. The name stuck. Yet Rome did not fall in Britain with a clash of armies. It fell in the mind. One day a merchant looked at the empty wharves of London and realized no ship from Gaul had arrived in a year. A farmer noticed the tax collector had stopped coming and felt not relief, but dread. A magistrate stood in the forum he had paid to erect and heard only birds. The empire had been a story more than a structure. When the story ended, the stones meant nothing. Still, the stones endured. And centuries later, when that anonymous poet picked his way through the rubble of Bath, he felt the ghosts. He wrote, "Rollick is tes wheelstan, word Gebrocon. Wondrous is this wall stone broken by fate." The poem breaks off mid-thought like a man interrupted by the wind. But its question hangs in the air. Who were the giants, and why did they leave? The answer is both simpler and crueler than any poet could confess. The giants were engineers of appetite. They built to extract, to impress, to control. They succeeded so long as their roads carried taxes and their legions inspired fear. But appetite is not loyalty. When the center faltered, the edge remembered it had never been invited to belong. The Britons who had learned Latin in the forum's shade found their children speaking Old Welsh in wattle and daub huts. The Saxons who had guarded the shore discovered they could rule it. And the wall, once the edge of the world, became a quarry for sheep pens. Yet something did survive. Not law, not language, but memory. The memory that once order had been possible, that roads could run straight, that hot water could flow without fire, that a man might travel 300 miles and still be under the same law. When the poet called the builders giants, he was not describing their height. He was describing the scale of their absence. Today we walk the same island. We drive iron bridges over the same rivers. We argue over borders the Romans drew. We dig up their coins, their sandals, their dice, and we feel, though we rarely admit it, that we are trespassers in someone else's dream. But perhaps the dream was always ours. Roman Britain fell, yet its experiment of cities, of citizenship, of trying to knit the world with laws, never truly ended. It mutated. It became medieval charters, common law, parliaments, passports. Every time we queue for a bus, every time we trust a coin to buy bread, we resurrect, in miniature, the Roman faith that strangers can share a future. So when you next see a scrap of Roman wall wedged between glass towers, remember the poet. Remember the panic-buried coins. Remember Albinus sailing south with all our protection on board. And remember that civilizations are not murdered. They are abandoned. First by belief, then by taxes, finally by memory. The work of giants crumbled. Yet in the crumbling, they taught us how fragile, how necessary, how human every wall truly is.